in the first session, beginning with Katie Creel. Katie, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and I want to start with the first of what I hope are many thank yous to Alan and Sander. This has just been an incredible, incredible conference. I've learned so much. I have really loved being on this train racing at 20 miles per hour, 20 talks per minute, and it's been fantastic. So thank you to both of you. So this morning I'm going to talk about machines and humans doing science together. I heard the comment yesterday that the conference so far had been blissfully machine learning free, and now I've come to haunt your dreams at 9 in the morning with machine learning. So, however, I have phrased this in a very, hopefully philosophy of science friendly way, where we're going to start with some motivating examples, some cases, some good philosophy of science in practice, then some current themes in philosophy of machine learning, and then future directions based on the reoccurrence of older themes that have been familiar to us from this conference. So I want to start with Jocelyn Bell's discovery of the pulsar. So Bell and her team, she was a grad student working on this project, of building a fairly large for the time radio telescope. So they're out there in this field building this large array. They turn it on. It works pretty well initially, and then they turn to the project of analyzing the data. So this is what the data looks like, at least as it's visualized at the time. And we see these regular patterns, these bursts of frequency, and you see this one is labeled now, but of course, when people were initially viewing it, it was not labeled. And so Bell, in her current recollections of this event in the oral histories, says things that are really suggestive, things like, from one particular piece of the sky, an unclassified signal sometimes reoccurred, and my brain started to say, you've seen something like this before, haven't you? You've seen something like this before from this bit of the sky, haven't you? So she's experiencing it as this sort of maybe subconscious, certainly not volitional process where it just comes to be apparent to her that there is this pattern in the data and that the pattern is reoccurring. And what I think is interesting about this quotation is that the pattern is already divided into these features. The pattern is a pattern of this kind of signal coming from this part of the sky. So it has a location, it has certain qualities, and these qualities are apparent to her in virtue of her first recognizing this pattern. So as she talks about it now, she puts it in the context of contemporary radio astronomy. So she'll say things like, my project was to study quasars, and then we accidentally stumble over these things called pulsars. They were totally unexpected, totally unknown. But the next generation of telescopes will see millions of events per night with computers that sift through a huge amount of data. If we had access to a computer, we would never have programmed it to look for something so unexpected. How do you pick up things you don't know exist, the things you can't tell it to look for? So I think there are scientists in many data-enhanced fields that have a lot of data and that are using computers to sift through that data to look for patterns, that are experiencing this as a question or a challenge. How can we be surprised? How can we experience novelty? How can we look for things that we didn't know to look for in our data? And the scale of this data prompts the question, because observatories that are coming online, like the Vera Rubin Observatory, which many of us were familiar with under the old name of the Large-Scale Synoptic Survey Telescope, is going to produce something like 20 terabytes of data per night. And I think even the Jocelyn Bells of the world cannot go through that amount of data. It's simply impossible. And even a much smaller fraction than that is not surveyable or fully understandable by humans at the scope that you would need to detect these subtle recurrent patterns, and to remember that sort of volume of astronomical data to compare it to others. Now, of course, there are lots of things that machine learning can do. Machine learning is great at pattern detection. So in some sense, you might say this is a false problem. What is machine learning better at than finding patterns in data? So of course, there's this issue. If we're looking for known patterns, how do we find unknown patterns? But we can address that by looking for anomalies on purpose. So we can say things like, okay, here are all of the objects that we know to look for. Now find other objects that don't have those properties, but are clustered in the same way that our existing clusters are clustered. Or we can say, cluster the existing data, now find all the anomalies, whether or not they have friends, and then just show me that list of all the anomalies. Or we can do an interesting combination of anomaly detection with sort of Rubin style, with Bell style active surveying, where we can do this technique called active learning, where the system will say, hey, here are all the anomalies, human in the loop, you tell me which ones are interesting, and then I'm going to learn from that. So there's this active process of refinement of the search for the anomalous. And it turns out that some things are anomalous because they're corrupted or the data is messed up, and then some things are anomalous because they appear to have genuinely different properties in some way. And so the human can help do that differentiation even on new data. So we can address this problem in a bunch of different ways. We can say, okay, maybe we're going to train a bunch of citizens to label galaxies. Citizens aren't willing to do all scientific grunt work, but for some reason we do enjoy looking at pictures of galaxies. So we're going to train citizens to label the galaxies. That will give us this huge labeled training data set that will help us look for the things we do know to look for. And that will, in turn, help our anomaly detection. But still, there's this question that many scientists are raising. What is lost in automated discovery? And one thing might be just this sheer sense of wonder. And the hard-nosed among us might say, ha, get rid of it. But Adam Smith says wonder and awe are motivational scientific emotions. They are what cause us as scientists to be willing to devote more time to the pursuit of these questions. So if we lose this sense of wonder and awe at finding a novel pattern in the data set, do we lose some of the motivational force of science? You could also imagine a concern that maybe humans and automated techniques are finding slightly different kinds of things. So maybe there are patterns that a human-type perceiver might be more likely to recognize than the ones that our current automated techniques are likely to recognize. And so maybe there's some kind of lost there in that gap. But even these we could try to address to some extent. So some of you in the room are familiar with a lovely physicist named Mario Kren, who shows up at a lot of philosophy conferences to be our friend. And he has published a bunch of papers about quantum optics and the use of AI for various stages of the sort of creative part of this pipeline, whether it's searching the literature for novel hypotheses and then proposing those, or whether it's proposing actual structures and then proposing new ways of evaluating them. But what's interesting is that after a few years of this research program with this very AI-augmented science, his lab now has a paper about using VR to visualize these novel structures so that, again, humans can not only understand them better themselves in this 3D space, but also intervene on the discovery and suggest a different path for future discovery, kind of in this active learning, human-in-the-loop model. Okay, so let me give you a second concern. So maybe the issue is something like opacity. So we have these classic examples from the epistemology of the LHC group about opacity at the Large Hadron Collider. So remember, we have these collision events that are happening at the rate of millions of events, each of which has a bundle of associated data. And we can't save all of that data. It would be way too expensive. We're producing petabytes of data per day. And so for these events, the goal is to, of the 600 million collision events, let's say, we're only going to save the data from 100. So that's a huge reduction. And the initial stages of reduction, physicists were very comfortable with. So people would use FPGAs, which is a type of hardware, to do the initial sort on principles that they felt were very well grounded. But after that initial sort, there was still a need to cut the pool even further and save even fewer of these collision events. And so the hope was, can machine learning classify these events and figure out which ones to save? And so at first they were just using very simple things they were calling deep learning, but actually had only 2 layers. Normally we say there have to be at least 3. 3 is deep. That's the cutoff. But now they are talking about using much more complex models and piloting some cases of using more complex models. And then the question is, if machine learning can do this classification more quickly but less transparently, does that become a nightmare for physicists? So automated discovery, computational opacity, these are often framed at the beginning of philosophy of science papers, including mine, as nightmares. As these are the nightmares that haunt the dreams of scientific practitioners, and we need to step in and help them sleep a little easier. That's one of the roles that we can play as philosophers of science. So what's interesting and what I want to highlight in this future day of past, present, and future is that a lot of these problems in current philosophy of machine learning are very familiar philosophy of science problems. So discovery, we saw, of course, with Hansen, we saw with Feigl. People have been interested in discovery for a very long time in our field, and our field isn't very old. Transparency, maybe that's a new word, but I think in a lot of ways we have been interested in the themes of transparency as they connect to explanation, as they connect to understanding. What do we need to know about this system in order to have the right kind of scientific beliefs or justifications connected to it? And then reliability and trust. How should we know whether to trust this model, whether to trust this simulation, whether to trust this completely non-computational idealization that we're making? These are all very familiar themes to us. And so the philosophical problems of machine learning and science are drawing from a cluster of concepts and issues that I think, are well positioned to address. But one thing I want to note about them is that there's this other sort of more futuristic idea of automated science. And the idea that automated science in some sense should not just be these sort of uses of computational techniques to model, to simulate, to find patterns in data, to reduce data to manageable size, to fill in gaps in data, but instead that the automated techniques should take on some kind of even more autonomous role. And that could be sort of stuff that's already happening, like automated liquid handling workstations, where you have a little robot in a clean room that can do pipetting, and where computer vision techniques can be used to analyze the results of those little micro experiments, and then decide in a pretty offline way what are the little experiments that we should do next. And this can be really useful when you're doing some kind of drug development or biomedical task where you just want to try thousands of things, but you don't want to be stupid about it. You want to have some kind of principle where you learn from each iteration which of the possible options are best to do next. This can be somewhat automated. But when people in philosophy of science and in science talk about automated science, they often mean something even more aspirational. So I was at a conference with Friedrich Eberhard in the fall, and he said, I think it would be really great if we could just set out a autonomous vehicle or, a collection of instruments, and these instruments would collect data and they would just start doing science from scratch with all new categories. And I was like, Friedrich, please put this in a paper so I can argue with it. Do me a solid. And he was like, no. But luckily, I found a very similar thing in Humphrey's 2004, where he says, one of the principal achievements of science has been to transcend the limitations of humans' natural epistemic abilities. But could human participation be avoided entirely? So there is this dream that's sometimes expressed that the human could be removed from science and that would have some kind of epistemic benefit, that something about science would be certainly different, but maybe even better. And people cash that out in different ways. So for Humphreys, the idea is that computational techniques sort of exist in this rough lineage of telescopes and microscopes, tools that extend our capacities, that allow us to perceive things that we couldn't otherwise perceive. But they're not just perceptual, they're also cognitive aids. And so as a result of these both perceptual and sort of cognitive aids, science has driven humans from the center of the epistemological universe, and scientific epistemology is no longer human epistemology. So that is a bold claim, and I think in response to that, other philosophers of science have said, hey, wait a second, we actually don't view that as a positive future. We want to ensure that science will remain human. We want to think about, in these computational techniques, will science still have the human character that we value? But one of the things that I want to suggest today is the many epistemic barriers to even the realizability of automated science. Even before we get to the evaluation as good or bad of fully automated science, what would need to happen in order for this to be possible? This autonomous system that collects data and comes up with its own novel categories. So one thing I want to suggest is that this agent would have to somehow identify the same entity or process in two different modes of perception. Because remember, this agent has all of these sensors, vision, it has haptics, it has probably LiDAR, it has a whole bunch of different sensors, and now the question is, what is the same? So we in philosophy of science and also in metaphysics have done a lot of thinking about this question. How do you stabilize the re-identification of the same thing, whether that's a species, what counts as the same species, or whether that's even an entity, what counts as the same entity or process? And I think we can see kind of an example of a human trying to do this in an even earlier radio telescope experiment. So Bell Laboratory was famous for many scientific innovations, but one of their actual problems that they had in their actual business was that there was too much static on the telegraph lines. So they said, Jansky, figure out why they're static and how we can get rid of the static. And so Jansky starts, again, very similar to Bell, trying to figure out where is the static coming from, what's the pattern. And he says, okay, it seems to kind of move across the sky. I don't know why. The static is probably from thunderstorms that somewhere in the world, and I don't know where the thunderstorms are, and the thunderstorms just have this pattern. But it turns out that the hissing noise that he was experiencing as static was actually the Milky Way moving across the sky. That was producing this static that was detectable in this radio array. So I think there's an interesting correspondence here between this problem of identifying something that you in fact already knew about, the Milky Way, you already could identify it visually, in this completely new modality where no one knew how to identify anything, namely radio waves, a radio telescope. So this is a new modality, a new kind of data. And the question is, how do you figure out what is the same entity in this new type of data that you could already identify visually? And I think that ends up being similar to a Molyneux's problem. So just as Molyneux, and I will explain this in a second, had a learner who had to correspond touch and vision. Here we have to make a correspondence between vision and radio. So when Locke summarizes this question, he says, suppose a man who's born blind and is now an adult has to distinguish between a cube and a sphere. Suppose you put them on a table and you restore the vision of the blind person. Before he touches them, can he figure out which one is the cube and which one is the sphere? So here's a case where this person is very good at identifying these two objects by touch and distinguishing them, but now we haven't given this person the opportunity to use that touch to bootstrap vision. Instead, they're kind of separated. By the way, we call this Molyneux's problem, but it very probably came from this novel by Ibn Tufayl, which was 300 years earlier. So it turns out humans probably can't do this. It's a little bit contested. Certainly, it was very hard to tell whether they could do this in the early modern period. Imagine doing 1700s cataract surgery, and then the person wakes up and you say, cube or sphere, cube or sphere. I mean, just not a good situation. But now that we can do it in more humane conditions, it seems like probably it's hard for the person to do until they have some experience associating these two modalities. But in a way, this is a problem that we encounter all the time in science, and we are just so good at it that we don't always notice. So how do we associate natural cork bark, as it appears to us, with cork under the microscope? How do we associate this known data modality of the Milky Way with this new data modality that Jansky is experiencing? So this kind of Molyneux problem has formal features. We're introducing this new kind of data. They have to recognize the entities that they previously knew and distinguish them from one another. And you have to do that somehow without these co-locations in time and space. Now, maybe you could say, well, our automated learners should be able to have that. They need to be a fully interactive robot that can intervene and figure out how to solve this problem through intervention. But notice that now we've said something very particular about what the automated scientist would have to be like. They can't be the thing that's most standardly proposed, which is just a passive scanner of all the existing big data to find patterns. They do have to be this sort of like interactive, out and about in the world entity. And this is a problem that people are addressing under a different name in multimodal automated science. So how do we co-evolve sensory modalities? How do we figure out how to leverage action for perception? Because there are lots of different sensors that an automated system could have. Fingertip force, robotic skin, etc. Okay, so instead of thinking about the future of philosophy of machine learning as being in this direction of automated science, which I think has a lot of problems in addition to the one that I just highlighted, I think we can learn from the previous 2 days of the conference and from past sort of cyclical evolution of philosophy of science. We can allow the dead to teach the living, even though in philosophy of science we don't have that many dead, thank goodness. Most people are still alive. And this sort of like ghost of the philosophy of ML future can help us. So as I said before, one thing to note about these problems is that they have this traditional character. But I think they're not drawing evenly from all of the philosophy of science that we currently have. Instead, they're very solipsistic. They're about this relationship between an individual knower and their scientific data. And so there are these epistemic concerns that are sort of detected between the scientist and their ML model, but not in a very social way. So there are two ways that you could imagine introducing sociality and introducing the social character of science to the philosophy of machine learning in science. One would be, of course, looking at the way that machine learning, a completely different use of machine learning, shapes the social structure of science. So one thing I've looked at here in collaboration with Liam Bright, who wanted to be here today and says hi, is we could look at how machine learning shapes our scientific incentive structures. So there are lots of proposals as many people in this room know, to evaluate things like grants with machine learning. Can we predict, instead of doing NSF career grants, can we use machine learning to predict who will be productive? Can we assess the quality of different scientific conferences? Why is philosophy of science, past, present, and future better than all other conferences? Can we detect that just from the program using natural language processing? That's a research question. Can we use machine learning to predict project efficiency? Can we use machine learning and text analysis to predict the extent to which a proposal matches the language in your national funding priorities? So these are all different ways that machine learning can be used to evaluate science, and they're taken to be responsive to some of the concerns that Carol Lee mentioned yesterday. So researchers are spending all this time reviewing, but it's not clear that their reviewing quality is very good. It could be biased in lots of ways. There's low inter-reviewer agreement. But interestingly, one thing that machine and automated systems are very different at, I'm not going to say better or worse yet, than humans, is that they're much more consistent. So if you give the same algorithm, the same file, it will have the same judgment unless you've changed the algorithm. Whereas if it's a deterministic algorithm. Whereas if you give a human the same file, even people who are trained their entire lives to make judgments, like judges and doctors, will give different answers about 30% of the time. So you give them the same blinded file, and they give you a different judgment. Whereas as long as the algorithm and the input haven't changed, you will get the same answer out of a lot of systems. And in some work with computer science co-authors, we argue that this kind of algorithmic consistency has potential to go even further. So there are lots of ways that machine learning has been epistemically successful because of shared components. So if there's a really good image database, a lot of people will use it. If there's a good library, a lot of people will use it. If there's a good or prestigious competition, a lot of people will enter it. But all of these are standardizing moves. All of these are forces that cause the outcome of epistemic judgments to be more similar than they might otherwise have been. If you train on the same data set, as Leonelli has suggested, you're more likely to get the same kinds of answers. And so this kind of homogenization is also going to happen when we think about what machine learning systems are trained on in automated grant review and other types of effects on the social structure of science. So if you only have one collection of all scientific papers and you only have 2 attempts to capture that, Scopus and the Web of Science, but they're both aiming at the same thing and would succeed to the extent that they could capture all scientific papers, then training on them probably is going to end up with learning some of the very similar patterns in data, because you just don't have another completely different repository of all science. So if we're learning these same patterns, there's a homogenization force that has the potential to reduce the epistemic diversity of projects that get funded in science. So in addition to the social structure of science as a way to think about the social future of machine learning and philosophy, I also want to say more speculatively, these questions that are in the little 4-box diagram that many people, including myself, have been focusing on in the epistemology of machine learning and science, are very individual. And so what would it look like if we instead thought about how does machine learning intervene in science as a social world, in the ways that scientists communicate, form ideas, in the variables that they pick, in the ways that they compare models with other models. How does it intervene in the kind of collective practice of science more broadly? So a few things that we could look to here would be things like functional concept proxies. So Florian Boge talks about these substructures in deep neural networks that could function as imprecise proxies for concepts. But thinking about Angela's talk yesterday, we might have this question. Well, if some logical empiricists were right and there was some value in having these sort of social terms that existed across contexts, even if people use them in different ways, that tie together different people's understanding of these scientific terms and that unify their efforts, even if they don't unify the precise content of their use of those terms. How does that work if a lot of these sort of mid-level concepts that are being effectively used are novel machine learning-based concepts that we don't always have access to? So does that change the way that our mid-level concepts circulate in scientific communities? And here I think we could look to feminist philosophy of science, we could look to social epistemology of science, and we could look at how different contextual values of research groups shape the models that they make, but also allow those models to circulate and travel. So these are some speculative ideas for the next wave of philosophy of machine learning and science. But I think what we're seeing is that philosophy of machine learning and science is kind of doing this speed run through 20th century philosophy of science. And I'm just encouraging us to run a little faster and to get to some of the good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you for that fantastic talk. Really, really interesting stuff and a very nice addressing of a lot of issues that scientists are definitely dealing with. I was actually going to ask a question about the fact that most of the modern machine learning algorithms are not deterministic and are in fact give you different answers with every run. And to address the question of something different from, say, a telescope or a microscope that is deterministic. But then given your last section, I actually am now kind of want to ask a slightly different question, because your description of using these deterministic algorithms for social things like identifying grants, put it bluntly, terrifies me. And so now I'm wondering are we seeing determinism and non-determinism in the wrong places? And so my question is, can you talk a little bit about where having deterministic algorithms is good and where having non-determined algorithms is good? Because, I mean, like the Jocelyn Bell point at the beginning, if you're doing grant funding based on purely deterministic algorithms, you're not going to find the cool stuff.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks for the great question. Yeah, I am really interested in this question of what's the right place for deterministic and non-deterministic algorithms. And I would take it a little further and say something that I think by the tenor of your question you would agree with, which is what's the right way to use non-deterministic algorithms? So one thing that I think is really interesting and important, but as far as I can tell, not being done very often, is that especially for these sort of smaller, less complex machine learning algorithms that are being used in these social contexts, like allocating grants, there often isn't an interest in modeling the uncertainty of that algorithm. And so one thing you could do, and that my co-authors and I are advocating for, is to say, okay, great. So let's say you run it a bunch of times with a bunch of different random seeds, you get a bunch of different answers. You then have this distribution on your own certainty about each of those judgments. Don't just throw that away. That's information. Instead, every time you do an allocation, sample randomly from that distribution in accordance to the strength of your belief about how good this grant is. That at least would be a start, and that at least would more accurately reflect your own best guess, which right now is being, really truncated by unwarranted determinism. But even there, you might say, is that non-deterministic enough? We're still just sampling from this one distribution of this one model that we happen to create. We know there are a lot of other different models that we could create that would highlight different features that we might think are important, let's say for grants or whatnot. And so I think figuring out how to balance both non-determinism within a particular model and having sort of complex models that capture different features that are relevant of the situation, as well as, I hope, having some kind of, I think it's easy to put too much weight on the idea that there's a human in the loop who's somehow going to rescue amazing grants from the bottom of the pile, when the whole point of this was that people feel overwhelmed by the number of grants that they're being asked to read and want to read only half of them. So I'm not that optimistic that if we are using these techniques, we are also somehow going to have a human that's gonna fix the problems. But nevertheless, building in a process where there is a human who's required to sample some of the low-rated grants and see, is there anything systematic that we're missing, could be helpful.
Thank you. The Molyneux problem was very interesting, but I felt like I missed something. So you raised the problem, and then you seemed optimistic about our track record for doing that and thinking about extending our observational faculties through tools. But that's more about us and not about the machines doing it. So I was wondering what you thought about the machines doing it, if they do it better than us or what.
Yeah, I think I don't have a view about that yet. It's an interesting question. I think I was just trying to raise that this would be a problem that machines would have to solve, and that it doesn't seem solvable through passive data analysis. It seems to, when we do it, it seems to require us to do some kind of, co-location in space and time that happens in a temporally and spatially extended way. And so maybe it would be either we need totally new methods, or if we're going to repeat the methods that have worked for us, that constrains what this automated scientist could look like. Yeah, thanks for the clarification.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. So I have two questions, I guess. The first one was, I'm actually really happy to hear about you mentioning Kathleen Bell, because she actually didn't get a credit for discovery of the pulsars, and it was her advisor and a few other scientists who got that Nobel Prize. So I wonder, if we incorporate something like machine learning in a research project, if that actually leads to some major discovery that should be highly awarded, who should get the credit for it? Should we award a machine, or should we award whoever create an algorithm or write a program, or who else? And secondly is about, there's a recent preprint archive, which is titled, GSM Symbolic Understanding the Limitations of Mathematical Reasoning in Large Language Models, which was done by a group of Apple scholars. And they basically were saying their findings in that preprint was that AI actually is terrible at doing mathematical or logical reasoning. And the idea basically, in short, is just AI knows a lot, but it doesn't understand anything. So I'm wondering if we try to use AI in, say, scientific research, what would be your take on the potential future capacities that's more than statistical analysis and data analysis, this kind of stuff? Do you think it's possible that AI might be advanced to a level that it can actually understand scientific concepts and theories and stuff, or it really is just merely for the sake of data analysis? And also if you think it could actually lead to some major scientific advancement at all?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think the two questions you asked are related, which makes sense because you asked them both. So I suspect you agree. So in order to figure out the answer to the first one, we would have to figure out the answer to the second one, right? We wouldn't award credit to a system that we didn't think had some kind of, I suspect, causal, agentive, understanding, whatever these oomphy words that we want to use are. We would have to think that the system had at least some of them in order to allocate some portion of the credit in a scientific context. my belief is that the systems that we have now are nowhere close to that, and we would have to have different in-kind systems in order for that to be on the table. Different people have different beliefs about that, obviously. But I think if we're thinking about something as formal as scientific credit, the kind of thing that you're referencing with Nobels or with authorship, I think we would also have to draw on the scholarship of people in this room in thinking what would be the social purpose of that. So like what would be the function of doing that? It's not to encourage the efforts of that system because we are the cause of whatever systems start running on whichever data, at least in the paradigm that we currently have and foresee having. So I guess I would be curious about what the sort of social credit purpose of allocating an award would be, and that would be my question.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.